Hey guys! Today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. On June 7th, 2023, 17-year-old Valerie Tyndall left her home for what was supposed to be a regular part-time job, but she never came back. In a small American town where everyone knew each other, something like this felt impossible. Her family was sure of one thing: she wouldn't have just vanished. Locals started combing through the surrounding areas, and law enforcement got involved almost immediately. But there was no trace of Valerie, not a clue, not a lead. Soon, strange things started to surface. Conflicting statements, silence from people who seemed to know too much, and behavior that no longer looked like coincidence. Everything pointed to the truth being closer than anyone realized, but it was being carefully hidden. Valerie Tyndall was born in 2006 in Indianapolis, Indiana's capital city. She spent her early years in an urban setting, but when she was 2, her family moved to Arlington, a quiet rural town about an hour's drive from the city. Her parents, Jack and Shayna Tyndall, made the decision to relocate out of concern for their children's safety. Their oldest son was about to start commuting to school alone, and living in a large city just felt too risky, especially with 5 kids in the family. Arlington was the complete opposite of where they had lived before, with a close-knit community of around 300 people, strong neighborly ties, quiet streets, open farmland, and a slower pace of life. It was the perfect place to raise a family. The Tyndalls quickly became part of the local fabric. The children found their circle of friends easily, and the adults embraced the warm and supportive atmosphere. Neighbors held block parties, got together for dinners, and looked out for each other. Valerie grew up surrounded by this environment, and for her, it became second nature. From an early age, Valerie was fascinated by animals. She'd spend hours watching cows and horses on nearby farms, helping out with poultry, and learning everything she could about pet care. By the time she reached middle school, she had already set her sights on becoming a veterinarian, and that ambition never wavered. She focused on science courses and worked hard to build the skills she'd need in the future. By the time she was 17, Valerie had finished her junior year of high school. One more year stood between her and college. Knowing how much effort it would take to pursue her dream, she wanted to contribute to her future. During the summer of 2023, she started looking for a part-time job to save up for her education. Her first try was at a local fast food restaurant, but she quickly quit. The pay was low, and the work environment was overwhelming. After bouncing between a few odd jobs, a friend stepped in with a helpful suggestion. Her grandfather, Patrick, a retired man and longtime neighbor of the Tyndalls, ran a small private business doing yard work, mowing lawns, repairing fences, and building garden sheds. Valerie had known him since she was little and had no reason to turn down the offer. The job seemed ideal: fresh air, quiet streets, and a familiar setting. Patrick, the grandfather of Valerie's close friend, had long been part of their family's circle. Everything about it felt safe and trustworthy. That summer job would turn out to be Valerie's last. The morning of June 7th, 2023, started like any other at the Tyndall home. Everything followed the usual routine. Valerie woke up on time, calm and collected. Over breakfast, she chatted with her mother and others at the table. She mentioned she was heading out to help Patrick, a longtime neighbor and trusted family friend. According to her, the work was going to be light, just some basic yard maintenance. She planned to be back by lunchtime. Nothing in her demeanor or words raised any red flags. She only took the essentials: her phone, wallet, keys, and wore light summer clothes. No bag, no change of clothes, no extra personal items. She hadn't mentioned any additional plans. It looked like just another workday, the kind she'd had many times before. Her absence during the first few hours didn't worry her family. In the summer, jobs with Patrick could sometimes run long, depending on how much work there was, the weather, or the condition of the property. Occasionally, Valerie would stay a bit later to finish a task or earn a little extra money. She might be watering plants, tidying up, or doing outdoor chores. So her mom, Shayna, wasn't immediately alarmed. She just assumed Valerie had stayed to wrap things up. But by late afternoon, concern started to grow. Valerie had said she'd be back by midday, but 5 o'clock was approaching and she still hadn't returned. Shayna decided to give her a call, just to check in, ask how things were going, and find out when she'd be home. But as soon as she made the call, something felt off. It went straight to voicemail. That was out of character for Valerie. Even when busy, she always managed to answer or call back later. Shayna tried again a little while later, but the phone remained off or unreachable. That's when she began to feel uneasy. Realizing something wasn't right, Shayna reached out to Patrick to confirm whether Valerie had actually been working with him. In this close-knit area, people didn't hesitate to talk directly, especially in situations like this. What Patrick said next was the first real warning sign. He sounded surprised and told her he hadn't made any plans with Valerie that day and hadn't seen her since the day before. He added that, from what he'd heard, Valerie was supposed to be meeting up with friends and might have planned a trip to Indianapolis. He didn't explain where he got that information. His words didn't sit right with Shayna. She clearly remembered Valerie saying she was going to work that morning, nothing about any trip, and she'd spoken with certainty, as if it had all been confirmed. Plus, Valerie wasn't the kind of person to keep plans a secret. Their household was built on trust, and she usually gave a heads up if anything changed. She had no reason to lie, especially to her mother, and certainly not to just leave without telling anyone. Shayna shared her growing concern with her husband Jack, who had just gotten home from work. Hearing the situation, he immediately sensed this was more than a simple delay. The parents began to go over all the possible explanations for their daughter's absence, but none of them made sense. The first thing Valerie's loved ones did was check the most obvious places she could have gone. Together, they walked around the neighborhood, stopped by the nearest park, checked local stores, and visited friends. But no one had seen her since that morning. No one had any idea about her plans for the day. No one had heard her mention a meetup or a trip out of town. By 7 p.m., concerned neighbors began showing up at the Tyndall house. Some came after hearing that Valerie wasn't answering her phone. Among them were Patrick and his wife. Patrick once again claimed he hadn't seen her and had no idea where she might be. His story was consistent with what he had told Shayna earlier. He showed no visible concern and remained calm and composed. The atmosphere grew more tense. Valerie's parents were overwhelmed by a growing sense of fear and helplessness. Hours passed, and it became increasingly clear that this wasn't just a late return. By midnight, the family decided it was time to take official action. They filed a missing person report. The report was submitted to the Rush County Sheriff's Department, launching a formal investigation. But at the outset, the investigators had very little to go on. Shayna's account, Valerie's inactive phone, and the conflicting stories between what Valerie had told her mother and what Patrick claimed. Once the report was filed, things in Arlington escalated quickly. Despite being a small community, local authorities wasted no time in kicking off search efforts. Valerie's disappearance was added to the county's incident report, and officers from the sheriff's office began responding within hours. Interviews started with those closest to Valerie, her parents, siblings, neighbors, classmates, and friends. That same day, officers contacted people who had spent time with her at school or socially. Yet, no one knew anything about her plans for June 7th. No one recalled hearing about a trip, a meetup, or receiving messages that suggested anything out of the ordinary. These interviews didn't yield any clear leads. Valerie's parents provided a detailed account of what she had with her when she left. Just her everyday clothes, her cell phone, and her wallet. She hadn't taken a change of clothes, any personal hygiene items, or a bag. Her room was untouched. Makeup, chargers, school supplies, and other belongings were all in place. That ruled out the idea that she had planned to leave on her own. Valerie's phone had been off since the middle of the day on June 7th. The last known signal was traced to somewhere in Arlington, and after that, the device never reconnected to any network. There were no signs that it had moved to another location. This suggested she had not left town. Her green 2000 Honda Accord was also missing, but no street cameras in the area captured it, leaving the neighborhood. News of Valerie's disappearance quickly reached local media. By the next morning, her photo, along with a description of her clothes, height, hair, and eye color, and last known location, was published in the press and widely shared across social media throughout the state. Law enforcement publicly stated that Valerie could be in a potentially dangerous situation and ruled out the idea that she had left willingly. The people of Arlington didn't hesitate to help. Not only local residents, but also neighbors from nearby towns joined the search. K-9 units, drones, thermal imaging devices, and ground patrols were deployed. Search teams combed riverbanks, wooded areas, open lots, and farms. Residents even checked their own sheds, basements, attics, and garages. Over the course of 2 days, almost every corner of Arlington and its outskirts was searched. Despite the large-scale search effort, no trace of Valerie was found. Neither her phone nor her car turned up, and she herself had seemingly vanished without a clue. In a small, tightly knit town, such a complete disappearance felt deeply unsettling and nearly impossible to explain. While the search continued, law enforcement began digging deeper into the case. Officers started reviewing Valerie's social media activity, checking her messages and call history. Her parents granted investigators full access to her accounts. There were no signs of emotional distress, no conflicts, no intentions of running away. On the contrary, her conversations were full of normal teenage things: school, part-time jobs, and hangouts with friends. Her plans were clear and completely typical. Although no official suspects had been named at that point, certain details began to raise concerns. One neighbor's behavior caught the attention of Valerie's family. He claimed he hadn't seen her the day she disappeared, but that conflicted with what Valerie herself had said earlier that morning. Patrick's name wasn't yet mentioned in any official capacity, and no formal steps had been taken regarding him, but doubts were beginning to take shape among those close to the case. In the early days of the investigation, Patrick's name came up only in passing. He was just the family's neighbor, the grandfather of Valerie's friend, and her part-time employer. Still, something about his version of events didn't sit right with Shayna. She wasn't just troubled by the inconsistencies in his statements. There was also something about his behavior in the months leading up to Valerie's disappearance that had made her uneasy. According to Shayna, Patrick had been showing Valerie an unusual amount of attention. He often offered her rides, asked a lot of questions about her schedule, and later, Shayna found out that Valerie had been sharing her phone location with him. Valerie explained that he used it for safety reasons. He claimed to do the same with his granddaughter. But to Shayna, that kind of closeness between an older man and a 17-year-old high school student didn't feel appropriate. While there had been no concrete reason for alarm, a sense of unease had lingered. After Valerie was reported missing, Patrick was brought in for his first official interview. He told officers that he hadn't seen her on June 7th and that they had made no work arrangements for that day. Later, he added that he'd heard from his granddaughter that Valerie had plans to go to Indianapolis. But when police spoke to the granddaughter, she denied ever saying that. She hadn't even spoken to Valerie that day and knew nothing about any trip. These contradictions led investigators to bring Patrick in for a second round of questioning. This time, his story changed dramatically. He now claimed that he had in fact seen Valerie that day. According to his revised version, they had planned to work, but the job fell through, and Valerie supposedly asked him for a ride to a nearby town. He said he dropped her off at an agreed-upon spot and drove away immediately. This sudden shift in his story raised serious red flags. When asked why he didn't share this version earlier, Patrick said he was scared, worried that he'd be seen as a suspect. But investigators weren't buying that explanation. His changing statements were viewed as an attempt to mislead law enforcement, which gave them grounds to temporarily detain him for providing false information. However, legally, that charge wasn't enough to keep him in custody. After going through the standard bail process, Patrick was released. While there were no legal grounds at that moment for further action, he was no longer just a witness. He was now the primary focus of the investigation. Following his contradictory statements, detectives began verifying every detail he had shared. Crucially, witnesses began to come forward. One neighbor reported seeing Patrick behind the wheel of a vehicle that matched Valerie's green Honda Accord. Two other witnesses claimed they saw him with Valerie earlier that day, walking together along a nearby street. These accounts directly contradicted Patrick's initial claim that he hadn't seen her at all on June 7th. A few days after investigators gathered initial testimony, the police located Valerie's green Honda Accord. The car was found parked in a residential neighborhood, with its license plates removed. The location matched what Patrick would later disclose. While the vehicle didn't show signs of a struggle or other obvious evidence of a crime, the fact that it had been relocated and stripped of identifiers immediately raised suspicions. By this point, K9 units had been brought in. The search dogs examined the area around Patrick's home and showed heightened interest in a section of land near a small artificial pond. Multiple times, the dogs signaled the same exact spot, suggesting the potential presence of biological traces. Still, no physical evidence or remains were found at that time. There wasn't yet a legal basis to search the property. A dog alert alone wasn't considered sufficient proof to obtain a warrant. Meanwhile, investigators began surveillance of the site. Weeks later, they noticed odd behavior. Patrick had started digging in various areas of his yard. In some spots, he was seen covering freshly dug holes with construction debris and soil. These actions were documented through both photos and video recordings. His behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious. At the same time, investigators turned their attention to Patrick's wife, Linda. She lived in the same house and, according to available information, had been home on the day of the suspected incident. Despite this, she had not been called in for questioning and had made no public statements. Investigators believed she might know something, though there was no direct evidence linking her to the situation or indicating her involvement. It was becoming more and more evident that Patrick's property might be hiding signs of a serious crime. However, law enforcement's legal options were still limited. They needed more concrete grounds before they could begin digging. The team had to find alternative, lawful ways to gain access to the land, which could potentially contain key evidence. While continuing surveillance, investigators concluded that standard procedures wouldn't be enough. They still couldn't get a search warrant without stronger proof, so they opted for a technical solution, conducting a topographic scan of the property. The aim was to detect changes in the landscape and find signs of recent ground disturbance. Using specialized scanning equipment capable of reading underground structures, they obtained results that showed signs of soil movement over time. In one area, they detected inconsistent layers of soil, and beneath them, a dense rectangular object. These findings became the basis for a formal warrant request. The court approved it, and on November 28, 2023, the investigative team received official authorization to search the premises. Excavation began the very next day. The first spot targeted was where the ground irregularities had been recorded. The initial discovery was a wooden box containing adult content tapes. At first, this seemed unrelated to the case. However, investigators continued digging. Beneath the box, they found another structure. this one larger and buried deeper into the ground. When the wooden cover was removed, investigators found a black trash bag inside. Inside the bag was a body. Due to the condition of the remains, it wasn't possible to immediately confirm the person's identity. However, based on the size, clothing, and location, there was little doubt. Later, a dental examination officially confirmed that the body belonged to Valerie Tyndall. At the scene, authorities noted clear signs of an intentional burial. The setup was designed to divert attention from what lay underneath. The first box, containing adult tapes, appeared to be a decoy, placed to mislead anyone who might dig there. But the officers didn't stop at the surface, and their persistence paid off. Patrick was taken into custody that same day. Investigators quickly moved to conduct a thorough search of his home and the surrounding property. They were looking for additional evidence, but no new items were found. Patrick lived in the house with his wife, but at that point, he was the only one facing charges. Based on the discovery of Valerie's remains, the inconsistencies in his statements, and previously gathered evidence, he was formally named the sole suspect. Right after his arrest, Patrick was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied everything. He refused to admit any involvement, dodged investigators' questions, and maintained that he had nothing to do with Valerie's disappearance. Detectives attempted to appeal to his conscience, speaking about Valerie's family and the pain they were enduring. Still, he showed no reaction, not even when they brought up his own wife. The turning point came when detectives focused on one undeniable fact. Valerie's body had been buried on his property. They asked him directly, how could she have ended up there? After a pause, Patrick shifted his stance and said he was ready to share what really happened. He claimed the incident had been a terrible accident, not a premeditated act. According to Patrick's version, Valerie had allegedly come to him demanding money, threatening to accuse him of inappropriate behavior if he didn't pay. He insisted that there was never any relationship between them and described her actions as blackmail. He claimed that during the confrontation, she began removing her clothes, either to strengthen the threat or manipulate the situation, and in a panic, he lost control and strangled her using a belt from his pants. Afterward, he said, fear took over. He kept the body hidden in the house overnight. The next day, he buried it in the yard, building a wooden box to contain it and burying the decoy container of tapes on top. To further cover his tracks, he drove Valerie's car to a different part of town and removed the license plates. Despite this confession, investigators didn't fully accept Patrick's version of events. To them, the story of blackmail didn't add up. There was no evidence, no messages or behavior from Valerie that suggested she had made threats or tried to pressure him. Instead, detectives believed a different theory, that Patrick had developed an unhealthy fixation on Valerie, and when things spiraled out of control, he tried to cover up what had happened. While Patrick formally admitted involvement in Valerie's death, he denied having any intent. Investigators, however, viewed his actions after the incident, hiding the body, destroying potential evidence, and giving false statements, as clear signs that he had deliberately tried to avoid responsibility. These details became the foundation of a case that was soon forwarded to the district attorney's office for formal charges. Following his arrest and partial confession, the investigation concluded, and the case materials were handed over to prosecutors. Patrick chose not to take the case to trial. In March 2024, he signed a plea agreement. Under its terms, he was sentenced to 57 years in prison with no eligibility for early release. Given his age, this effectively meant a life sentence. The proceedings were conducted behind closed doors. Many in the community had expected a harsher outcome, but the charge did not include aggravated or premeditated intent. This format allowed the process to avoid a lengthy courtroom battle, but it also stirred mixed reactions. Some Arlington residents felt the outcome wasn't severe enough. The financial compensation assigned to Valerie's family also drew strong reactions. The court ordered that her parents receive only $10,000. Neither the court nor the prosecution provided a clear explanation for the low amount. Considering the emotional and legal weight of the family's loss, the compensation appeared merely symbolic. Though no appeals were filed, the family's disappointment was evident during a press conference held after the sentencing. At the press briefing, Jack and Shayna thanked the investigators, volunteers, and everyone who had helped search for their daughter. At the same time, they openly expressed their frustration with the limitations of the justice system, which failed to provide answers to their most pressing questions. Chief among them, what were Patrick's true motives? His confession hadn't convinced them, and they rejected his version of events. Another point of public concern was the role of Patrick's wife, Linda. She had been living in the house where Valerie's body remained hidden for over 24 hours. According to the investigation, Linda was never questioned as a suspect, and none of the searches uncovered anything that would warrant charges against her. Still, many in the community believed she might have known more than she let on. Linda never made a public statement, and her potential involvement was never addressed in court. Critics argued that it was difficult to believe Linda could be completely unaware of what had occurred inside her own home. Valerie's parents repeatedly voiced their belief that Linda had knowledge of the events. However, without direct evidence, law enforcement could not legally pursue charges against her. Forensic analysis of Valerie's remains failed to determine an exact cause of death. The injuries were not conclusive enough to reconstruct the full series of events. This meant the investigation had to rely almost entirely on Patrick's own account. There was no physical evidence to support his version, but also nothing definitive to refute it. In the end, while the suspect was punished, many parts of the case remained unresolved. The true nature of the incident, Linda's possible awareness, and Patrick's actual motivations were never fully clarified. Valerie's family got their day in court, but they didn't get the answers they were looking for. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.